Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the strange case of Edward Gough and the murder of James Partridge, which took place in the Sunnyside area of Gateshead in 1873. I hope you will find it interesting. There was very little information about the past life of one of those involved in this week's case, so their backstory will be quite basic. Edward Gough was said to be around 22 years old at the time the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1851. He was born in Ireland and his parents were described as cottars, which most likely means they would have worked as farm labourers with a cottage to live on the land. He moved to England in around 1869 and had taken a job as a miner at Sunnyside colliery in Gateshead. He had lodgings close to the colliery, and the couple who he lived with described him as being a quiet, hard-working man when he was sober, but once he began drinking, he became argumentative and also quite violent. He was said to be around 5'7" tall with a reddish-brown beard, and some said he looked a lot older than his 22 years. James Partridge, the victim, was also said to be around 22 years old at the time of his death, so would have also been born in around 1851. His place of birth and parents are unknown. He worked at Marley Hill as a labourer, and although no one described him as being addicted to drink, like many of the time, he did enjoy a drink on a regular basis. He was described as being around 6'2" and powerfully built. And it also seems that he was quite well known for getting into fights. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do find this video interesting, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is appreciated, and it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, and I think I've already made a couple, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. On the night of July the 7th, 1873, Edward and James were in the Greyhound public house in Gateshead. They had argued, although it was not clear what about, and twice Edward left the pub but returned a short time later. The second time he had left was after the landlord had asked them to be quiet, but he had come back inside and asked James to come outside and fight with him. The two men went outside, and as James was taking off his coat, Edward rushed forward and struck James in the thigh with a pocket knife. James cried out that he'd been stabbed and tried to get away from Edward, but he was only able to run a short distance before he fell to the ground, and the wound was so serious that he died in only a few minutes. Edward tried to run away but was caught by several other people who had come outside to see the fight, and he was held until the police arrived a short time later. He was then arrested for the willful murder of James Partridge, and his simple but strange reply was, "They have put it in for me." The inquest was held at Gateshead before Coroner Fable. No location was actually given, but it was most likely in either the police courts or one of the larger public houses in the area. William Hearn, a miner from Gateshead, said he had identified the body as being that of James Partridge, who was a labourer at the Marley Hill coke ovens and was around 22 years of age. James Brough of Marley Hill said he had been in the Greyhound pub on the night of the 7th. He said he saw Edward and James argue, but he could not say what it was about, as he could not hear them clearly. He said Edward went outside and was gone a short while before he returned and again began to argue with James. He said someone told them to be quiet or they would have to leave, and he said Edward briefly left, then came back in, swore at James and said, "Come outside and I will give you what you want." He said he followed them outside and he saw James Partridge taking off his coat to fight, but he said he could not quite see what happened next. He then saw James trying to get away from Edward and heard him say, "I am struck." He said he did not go far before he fell to the ground. He He said when he went over to where James was lying and Edward was trying to make his escape, he took hold of him to stop him getting away. He said he noticed Edward put something into his coat pocket. He felt the pocket and believed it was a knife. James Brough said he then put his hand inside the pocket and pulled out a knife and a handkerchief. He said he kept hold of these and he later gave them to PC Lancaster. He said another man then came over and helped to hold Edward until the police arrived. And he said later, with the doctor and Sergeant Foster, they had traced the blood on the ground back to the pub, and he felt that Edward had struck James Partridge as soon as he had come out of the door. John Kitt of Marley Hill said he had also been in the public house on the night in question and saw Edward and James argue, but he didn't know what it was about either. He said he heard Edward say, "I don't want any mischief with anyone," but later he heard him speak to James, asking him to come outside and fight. He said outside he saw the two men together, but he did not see Edward strike him with the knife. He said James began to move away from Edward, running along the road a little way before he collapsed. He said he followed James and someone told him to keep hold of Edward until the police arrived and told him that he had a knife. He said he held him for around 30 minutes, and during this time Edward had said to him, "You better mind or I will give you the same." Nicholas Welsh, a labourer from Marley Hill, gave similar evidence to the previous two witnesses and also said that he did not see Edward strike James, as there had been other men blocking his view. George Bell, a miner of Marley Hill, said he saw Edward rush at James as soon as he came outside. He said he had walked away and had not gone far when James came past him. He seemed to be trying to run and pulled down his trousers at the same time, as if trying to get to the wound in his leg, and he said he saw blood pouring from his thigh. He said he heard James say, "I am struck." He said after he saw him fall to the ground, he went over to where he was lying and heard him say, "I am dying." He said after James said this, Edward tried to run away but was caught almost immediately. Dr. Atwater of Wickham said he was called to the area on the night of the 7th, but by the time he arrived, James had been carried to his lodging house and was already dead. He said he found a large wound in his thigh, which was very deep. He said he'd also performed the post-mortem on the body of James Partridge and had found no other outward signs of violence. He said the large wound in his right thigh had cut the artery, and death, in his professional opinion, was caused by the great blood loss from this wound. He said the knife that had been shown to the jury could easily have caused such a wound. PC Lancaster said he was called to the Greyhound public house on the night of the 7th. He found James Partridge lying on the ground. He was already dead when he arrived, and he was carried back to his home. He said he had then arrested Edward Gough on a charge of wilful murder, and he was taken to the police station. He said the only statement that Edward made was, "They have put it in for me, but I don't think he is dead yet." Sergeant Foster said he went to the home of James Partridge on the 7th. He said he found him on the bed and he was already dead. He said he had removed his clothing to take his way as evidence, and this was then shown to the jury. And he stated that the hole in the leg of the trousers matched exactly the area where the wound in his leg had been. No further evidence was given, and I did not find any details of the coroner summing up, but I think we can imagine he would have told the jury to decide if they felt this had been a deliberate act, which would be murder, or if it had been an accident with no intent to kill, which would be manslaughter. The jury, after retiring for a very short time, returned a verdict of guilty of wilful murder, and Edward Gough was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for James Partridge, and based on the fact that it was a fellow workman who had identified his body, it is possible that he did not have any family in the area, and that the police had not been able to trace any of his relatives. This would sadly almost certainly make this a pauper's funeral, with no one able to pay the costs. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for James anywhere in the area. The trial was held at Durham in December of 1873 before Mr. Justice Honeyman, and this was not the only murder case taking place on the same day. Edward Gough pleaded not guilty to the charge. As is nearly always the case, the evidence is almost exactly the same as that given at the inquest, so I will only include any new information. John Kitt gave almost the same evidence as he had given at the inquest, only adding that he had heard James say he would fight Edward as long as he did not have him up in court afterwards. John said James had been recently taken to court for fighting with another man. When asked, he said it had been a light night, but he had not noticed a knife in the hand of Edward Gough before James was stabbed. James Brough added to his statement by saying that once outside the pub, several men had tried to stop the fight taking place, and it had been then that Edward had made a rush towards James and struck him. He also added that when James had cried out, he had said to Edward, "Surely you have not struck that man," but he said Edward did not reply. George Lancaster, who it now appears was no longer working as a policeman, said he had known Edward Gough for around 3 years and he had never known him to get drunk. He said he was a quiet man. He said when he had arrested him there'd been no blood on his clothes, however there was fresh blood on the knife he had been given by James Brough. The judge then read out a statement that had been made by Edward Gough, parts of which said, "I have done this act, but I did not intend to kill him. I was in drink at the time, and so was he. It was done accidentally. He," meaning James, "had been arguing with me, but I did not want anything to do with him." I did not find any details of the prosecution summed up. However, the defence simply stated that he felt this was a very clear case where the charge could be reduced from one of murder to one of manslaughter. The judge, in summing up, stated that this was a very serious case and the jury must give it careful consideration. His summing up after this was quite strange. He stated that the area of Durham seemed to be an area where the people were too ready to fight with guns and knives and other weapons. He then said that if the jury felt that while James was taking off his coat to fight Edward had rushed at him and stabbed him, then they must find him guilty of wilful murder. If, however, they did not feel this was the case, he still felt they could not find any other verdict than one of guilty of wilful murder. The jury retired for only 14 minutes before returning with a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against Edward Gough. However, they did recommend him to mercy as they felt he had committed the act in the excitement of the moment. Edward was then asked if he had anything to say as to why sentence of death should not be passed, and he made no reply. The judge then spoke to Edward, saying he had been found guilty of the wilful murder of James Partridge, and the jury could not have come to any other verdict. He then said that going out to fight with another man was illegal in itself, but if men must fight, then it was better to fight with fists than with knives. He said that he would make sure that the jury's recommendation to mercy would be sent to the correct authorities, but Edward should not hold out any hope of a reprieve. He then sentenced Edward to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the walls of Durham Prison. Edward, who seemed to be taking little notice of what was being said, was then removed from the dock and returned to prison. Despite the recommendation to mercy, it seems no one seemed to have had any desire to set up a petition to save Edward's life, and the Home Secretary did not overturn his sentence, and the hanging would go ahead in January of 1874. As you may remember, 3 men were hanged together on that cold January morning, one being Charles Dawson, whose story I covered recently, another was William Thompson, whose story I will cover soon, and the third was Edward Gough. The newspapers of the time did not cover their individual stories in great detail. Of the 3 men, Edward Gough was said to have had a restless night before the execution, waking almost every hour from 10 p.m. until 4 a.m, when it was said he was able to sleep for a couple of hours before being awoken at 6 a.m, where he was given breakfast of a chop, a bread roll and some tea. The hangman for Edward Gough and the other 2 men was William Marwood, and just before 8 a.m, all 3 men were pinioned, their arms tied at the wrists or elbows, sometimes both. They were all then led to the gallows, and Edward was placed below the middle rope. After this, William Marwood adjusted the ropes, and just before the white cap was placed over the head of Edward Gough, the Reverend Consett stepped forward and shook his hand. Gough did not make any statement. The white cap was then placed over his and the other men's heads. The signal was given, the bolt was removed, and all 3 men fell. Death was said to be instant. The black flag was then raised above the prison walls to allow the small crowd outside of the prison to know that the punishment of the law had been carried out. After the usual time of 1 hour, the bodies of all 3 men were removed and placed into plain coffins, and the inquests were then held, with a verdict of death by hanging being given by the jury. After this, they were buried within the walls of the prison, and as stated in the Charles Dawson video, they were said to be buried close to the grave of Mary Ann Cotton. As I often say, this was a very odd case. There was no real reason given for why the 2 men had argued that night in the pub at Gateshead. None of the witnesses seemed to have been close enough to hear what was said, and Edward never gave any reason himself. And it's not made clear if they knew each other well or if they had only met that very night. But whatever the issue was, it seemed to have angered Edward enough for him to want to fight with James. Why he then decided to use a knife to attack James is truly unknown. Perhaps as James was the taller, more powerful man, he thought he would not win the fight and felt if he wounded him, he would fare much better in the fight. Or perhaps he was simply so angry about the prolonged argument that he simply saw red and attacked with the knife for that reason. In his statement, he said he did not plan to kill James, it was an accident, and I guess I can kind of understand that, as it is quite easy to believe that he may not have thought a stab wound to the leg would cause someone's death. So was he really guilty of murder, or should it have been manslaughter? The judge seemed to be of the opinion that the jury could only find him guilty of murder, but I have to say that I feel it was more likely to have been manslaughter, as I honestly don't think Edward did know what would happen when he stabbed James in the leg, and if he planned to kill him, then I believe he would have aimed higher with the knife. But I think based on the judge's earlier statements about fights with knives, etc., he was perhaps hoping to persuade others in the future to think twice if they saw what happened to Edward. So were the jury correct to find him guilty of murder? Well, to be honest, I don't think they were. And I also think it is possible some of them may have had doubts of his guilt. However, the judge had made it clear that he expected them to find him guilty of murder. And I feel they felt they had no other choice. But what do you think? Do you think Edward planned to kill James? Or do you think being the smaller, less powerful man, he wanted to wound him to make it easier to fight with him, and he did not realise that he might die? Do you think the jury were correct to find him guilty of murder, or do you think it should have been manslaughter? And do you think perhaps this may have been what they would have said had the judge not told them guilty of murder was their only option? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next